It's really quite impossible to understand what's going on in the world if you don't understand blood. It's a bloody mess. What with the nonsense and the witchcraft and the Satanism. But I'll bet nobody has ever taken the time to explain it all to you. Worry not, now is your time. Blood is a powerful cohesive between this world and the next, or more specifically, the physical and the astral. It might seem like an odd place to begin a narrative on a blood, but the most direct relationship we get between blood and the negative principality is from Goethe in his classic two-part poem, Faust. In the epic narrative, Dr. Faust enters into a contract with an entity by the name of Mephistopheles, an agent of the devil or the devil himself, depending on interpretation. We get the following exchange. Mephistopheles: why launch into oratory too? Hot-tempered, you exaggerate as well. Any bit of paper's just as good, and you can sign it with a drop of blood. Faust: if it will satisfy you, and it should, then let's complete the farce in full. Mephistopheles: blood is quite a special fluid. If you're part of the Western world and its cultural and religious traditions, you might have noticed the role that blood plays. The central sacrament of the Catholic Mass is the consumption of the body and blood. This, of course, refers to the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Having been born to a Catholic family, I could never quite understand this ritual. It was explained to me numerous times by priests, my parents, my grandmothers, and even a bishop once. But I still couldn't understand it. I mean, come on. Some guy's blood is going to save me from damnation? Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is 9:38 p.m. on Tuesday, the 28th of May. And we can do part one of blood. There's so much to say about blood. There's a lot that has been said already. Some of it was covered in the Human Devil series of podcasts. I think there were 7 parts to that. Now, as I go through these topics in more detail and I drill down and I focus on something, always remember to pull back and get the whole context, okay? So whatever we're living through now, its conceptual birth, its occult birth, was in the 1800s, late 1800s, I suspect. It manifested in 2 world wars, both involving the same country, Germany, and the German people, who are perhaps one of the most exceptional people on the planet. A truly exceptional people. Inventive, creative, industrious, conscientious, precise. The 2 great engineering nations that have absolutely mastered the engineering and manufacturing process more than any other country are Japan and Germany. It's interesting that they were really our 2 enemies in World War II. Each of them wanted to be nation states in one way, shape, or form. And it's important that you understand what fascism is in its purest form, because I don't think it's a bad thing at all. I don't think National Socialism is a bad thing at all. Now, it's interesting that this was the form of governance and social organization that Germany chose. And had they not been called to war, they probably would have gone on to be the most powerful country in the world. Who stopped them? The countries wed to the money system. The countries wed to the bankers. The countries wed to the Masonic plan. You know, it's interesting to note that another thing that Hitler did was shut down all the Masonic lodges in Germany. So remember what I tell you, that Masonry is Kabbalah. Start to put everything together. It's very complicated. I wrote the book and I can barely hold it all in my head. You know, when you're writing a book, you can put it together kind of with I would say like a divine inspiration. A kind of super force comes in and helps you organize it and see things clearly. It's certainly beyond my normal human intelligence. This is why I made the realization that, you know, when I'm writing and I'm looking for where to go next in the book, it sort of comes to me just as a form of revelation. Very, very important thing to understand, the concept of revelation. Revelation is knowledge suddenly given, okay? So Germany and Japan were the powerhouses of the emerging manufacturing and industrial age. And through 2 world wars, we were able to put them down and make them work for us, make them work for the banking system, which was centered out of London. So London, until America takes over as the bulldog after World War II, the center of the Western world is London. It was London that got the Israel Project going in 1947. It was London that signed the Balfour Declaration in 1918 after World War I. It's very interesting to note that there's this major movement for the Zionists. After World War I, they get the legal recognition in the form of the Balfour Declaration. And then after World War II, they go to Israel in 1947. They start leaving Europe. Now, I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there. Some would have us believe that Hitler himself was a bastard Rothschild, and bloodline is very important to these people. We know this. And this is blood part 1, so bloodline is part of the whole thing. Okay? So we know from the material in the Human Devil that blood ritual is a big part of this culture that is running the world now, or is a force in the world now. There's little clues all over the place, but you have to start tying them together. As I said, you have to give yourself permission to see it. If you pray, pray for the permission to see it. Pray for the revelation. Those are the best things to pray for, by the way. If you're going to pray at all. You can wish for better health, but I wouldn't ask a God for better health. Better to ask why you got sick, because if the underlying issue isn't corrected, then the prayer is going to become a credit that you owe, because the gods are transactional, remember. Marker, debit. These gods are transactional. So really, at the center of whatever we're in, which has been going on for 140 years or so, maybe longer. Remember what Kat said about Darwin. Darwin's a big part of it. But it fits into my timeline. And part of the process has been to despiritualize the human race, to take away our sacred connection with nature. And we do have a sacred connection with nature when we're balanced and we're functioning properly. Again, I go to John Edmonds. I shared with him my belief that the whole space thing was extremely negative, and that the human race fantasizing about going to space was extremely negative. And he agreed with me. You think about all the time and resource that's been put into space in the 20th century. Now, a lot of it I think is false. I don't think we have gone to the moon, or at least not the way they told us. If we went to the moon, we did it with help. We did it with a partner race that helped us. And the human race does have partner races now. This is part of the secret space program. This is part of the secret government. This is beyond what Donald Trump calls the deep state. So imagine that. We have a human society amongst us now which is connected to and working with, commiserating with, exchanging knowledge, resources, and technology with at least one, maybe more, extraterrestrial races. This is why the 1947 chapter introduces the concept of space through Roswell. There are mechanisms in the collective human consciousness that anything happening in the third or fourth dimension is going to be figured out or intuited by human beings. It's going to come out into our reality. It has to. It's a spiritual law. It has to. And so into the mix came the entertainment industry, which is part of the military, industrial, entertainment, pharmaceutical complex, I would call it now. Pharmacy sort of being the last one, coming in really strongly in the 70s and 80s and just ramping up from there to the point where a significant percentage of Americans are on hard narcotics now, chemical, mind-altering narcotics. I think depression is a good thing. I don't think it's a disease. I think it's a spiritual state that has to be rectified through a realization. I think it's the longing of the heart for greater meaning. You take away that greater meaning in a satanic society and you cut people off, every medicine you give them is going to make them sicker. When you read spiritual biographies, and I've read quite a number, you see a similar pattern all the time. You see a very, very dark period in the person's life before they explode spiritually. This is the case with my good friend Bob, Robert Wiegand. It's the case with Milarepa. Siddhartha was called to become the Buddha at a very young age. His parents wanted him to stay in the family, and he had to go through trials to be released from the family. Many of the people who go into the deep Vedic training in India, in the Himalayas, are given over by their parents. The parents might be too poor to raise them, but rather than kick them out onto the street or something like that, they turn them over to spiritual training, because the attainment of consciousness, if the child is successful in attaining consciousness, it's a benefit for the whole family. When you raise your consciousness, everybody genetically associated to you, and even your ancestors on the other side, are affected. That's the power of consciousness work. So we've got 2 world wars that put Germany and Japan in their place. just to address the Ukrainian situation for a moment and tie it into this ongoing idea of Germany being deliberately kept down by the global forces. The country that suffered the most as a result of the bombing of Nord Stream 2, which was undoubtedly done by the Central Intelligence Agency, is Germany. Our news agencies don't really tell us what's going on anymore. We're not getting any real news anymore. The consequences of that energy deprivation through the bombing of Nord Stream 2 were decreased productivity in manufacturing and engineering for Germany. And subsequent to that, a dilapidation of the entire European economy, because Germany was the economic engine. No Germany, no European economy. Everybody suffers. Simultaneously, Europe is being flooded with immigrants that are really incapable of living in a first world. They're too old to be educated. They can't, you'd have to go back to, literally, you'd have to go back to grade 6 and start from there. How are you going to do that with men in their 20s and 30s? There's no great deficit of manual laborers or construction workers in Europe or North America. What are they all going to do? Why is none of this planned for? Why in North America, and specifically in the United States, is most of this being run by Jewish Family Services and Catholic Family Services, two non-governmental organizations, NGOs? What's really going on here? I can only speculate. I don't know. And if I do know, I know in my heart. And as such, it's not something that I'm really willing maybe to share at this point. But I suppose I have. That this seems to be very centered on the destruction of Western civilization. Now, I told you, in these circles, in these occult circles, they are God. And you need to realize that the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran are occult documents. They're not high spiritual documents, okay? Sorry if I offend you. I know people live by those books. But you shouldn't place your spiritual life in a book. You should place it in your spiritual experiences attained by spiritual work, period. Period. One of the things that I find really uplifting is all of the feedback I get from you in the comments and through emails and through contacting me on Facebook or Skype. When I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is I check my messages, and there's always something to just make me feel good. This is the equity. This is the spiritual equity for me at this point in my life. Makes me feel very, very good. A lot of you are reporting really strange synchronicities. I would say part of it is the vibration created by listening to these podcasts. I speak in a very, very casual way, but these words, these ideas, and specifically what I direct your perception to, what I direct your attention to, is meant to incite revelation and realization. And when you start that process, the positive forces on the other side come in. And part of those positive forces are you, the unconscious part of yourself that wants to join with the conscious part of the self and go into non-dualistic living. There's many forms of non-duality. The first form of non-duality that you have to break through is the duality of the inner life and the outer life. It's really one thing. Your thoughts and your feelings are directly contributing to the unfoldment of your timeline. This is covered in countless New Age nonsensical texts that don't really understand it, and generally are appreciated by materialists who think that if they focus a certain amount of intentional energy on the attainment or manifestation of a material object, they'll get it, which is an abuse of the consciousness abilities. The ultimate goal of consciousness is peace, harmony, divine love in your heart and in your life, and sufficient knowledge to transcend the fear of death. So when you engage these these so-called holy books in the Abrahamic canon, you're engaging with the occult. This is occulted information. Prophecy is as I've said before on my podcast, prophecy is the most nonsensical form of spiritual teaching ever given to man. And whoever did it wanted to harvest our energy the same way the negatives harvest it through fear. This would be the same thing, but by getting us to kind of fall in love with them and give them our energy. I put this squarely at the feet of the Palladians and whatever other mentor races were around when all this nonsense was going on. So when the architects and living administrators of this occult technology, the Abrahamic canon, a canon is a collection of books, when the architects, meaning the writers and the facilitators, the people who produced it, and the administrators, the people who are alive and conscious of what those books really are. When they say God, they mean themselves. That's the secret. And therefore nobody will think to look for anything else. Oh, it was an act of God. There are very few acts of God on this planet right now. Very few. Those forest fires in California several years ago, directed energy weapons. Hawaii, directed energy weapons. Alberta, which is in a war now with the Trudeau government and the Liberals. And this carries over from Trudeau's father, Pierre. He also went to war with Alberta and nationalized their energy resources. When they discovered the oil in the 70s, Trudeau went in there and nationalized it, and it infuriated the province of Alberta. Alberta, if you don't know, is in Canada, is a combination of like Montana and Texas. There's oil and cattle farming. Okay? They have big cities and everything, but I mean, so does Texas. You've got Houston, Dallas, San Antonio. You've got cities in Texas, right? It's the same thing. The big city in Alberta is Calgary. So keeping Germany and Japan down has been part of the agenda in the 20th century because they're probably the two populations on the planet that could entice the entire planet to do a redirect, to live a different way. They're that powerful. They're very powerful countries, very powerful national consciousness, very powerful national... They've achieved something very few societies did, and that is trusting each other and the ability to work together and to work towards a common goal. Now, when you look at the kinds of societies that have been created, deliberately created in the West, all through the 20th century, they're a mix of people. Right? It's very interesting to note as well that for a long, long time, Jewish diaspora populations had to coexist with other peoples because they didn't have a country. And throughout history, there have been large Jewish diaspora populations in certain countries. Around the 11th, 12th century, it was Spain. They were in Portugal as well. They were in Italy as well, mainly down around Sicily. Britain, they were let back into Britain in the mid-1500s after, I think, a 3.5 century expulsion based on a blood libel that was, according to the justice system of the time, proven to be true. Now, big voices in the Jewish community to this day call these anti-Semitic tropes, that they're not true. But why do they keep occurring? Why do they keep popping up everywhere? Why did Ezra Pound believe it? One of the smartest symbologists to live. You know that guy in the Da Vinci Code or whatever, that character in the book, played by Tom Hanks? In the Dan Brown books, that's a symbologist. Okay, Jordan Maxwell is a kind of pretend symbologist. No offense to Jordan Maxwell, he did some amazing work, okay? But a real symbologist was Ezra Pound, and you should look him up. You should absolutely look him up because he was an absolutely fascinating person. Henry Ford. Henry Ford. One of the most industrious and productive men in the history of the United States. Also a virulent anti-Semite. Also ringing the alarm bell about what he called the global Jew. The transnational Jew. So getting back on track, all of these countries we live in are constantly being chopped up into smaller and smaller parts with more and more diverse population. So now they're flooding the United States with all kinds of Central Americans, Africans, Middle Easterners, people from all over the world, but mainly Latin Americans, which I think is a good mix for the United States, by the way. I do. I wouldn't worry about that too much. But the Venezuelans are psychotic. So you see, anytime a country goes through a war, you're going to have a kind of a psychosis in the people for at least a generation, another 20, 30 years after the war. So when I went to university from 88 to 92, there were a lot of triad gang wars in Toronto. There were a lot of turf wars between the Chinese gangs. And the muscle, the people who would go by in the car with 3 or 4 machine guns out the door, shooting up the restaurant and stuff, always Vietnamese. Because they had that hardness. I have a gentleman on my mountain, Ramon de la Laguna, Ramon of the Lake, to differentiate him from another Ramon on the mountain. He was a Contra. He fought for the United States in the 80s through all that Barry Seal, Oliver North stuff. He actually fought on the American side against the Sandinistas. He now lives in Costa Rica. Very hard man. Very hard man. Anybody who kills a lot of people is a hard man. Or a woman. I don't want to be sexist. But I'm getting off track. What made the Japanese and the Germans so formidable was their collective consciousness. How they could become more than the sum of their population through a shared dream, a shared religion, a shared culture. It's a very powerful thing, and it's my thesis to you that all through the 20th century, there's been a force operating in the world breaking up strong cultures deliberately. Now, it's interesting to note at this time, as we're all being spread out into these multicultural experiences which really have no cohesion other than the government. There's no natural cohesion between people because everybody is from a different background. What's the advantage for a government, whether it be national or global, in a situation like that? You're never going to get any significant revolutionary force. That trucker convoy that happened a couple years ago in Ottawa, all those trucks were from mainly Alberta, the province in Canada that I just described to you, a combination of Texas and Montana. A lot of white people, some natives, some blacks. There are black people, obviously, in Alberta, but mainly white people. So how does Trudeau respond? They're Nazis. You see, the language they use, like white supremacy, when Joe Biden says this is the most significant threat to America, domestic terrorism through white supremacists, it's complete nonsense. What he is stamping out is unified cultural expression. So people come together through a unified cultural consciousness, which is not entrained by the society, through the education system, through the television, through all of the nonsense, okay? You see it now on the streets in the form of the Arab consciousness, protesting in favor of the Palestinians. That is a rising of this cultural consciousness. And throughout all of this, the great evil, the great Satan is the white man. Why? What did the white man ever do other than create a cultural consciousness that could work hard, produce, and uplift the prosperity for the entire civilization? Now, who would not want that to happen? Flip the coin. I've given you the heads, now I'll give you the tails. Throughout the 20th century, as we've been forced into a multicultural situation in Western countries, and I'm not saying that's bad. Let me be clear about that. I'm not saying that that is bad. But like I said this afternoon in the interview with Paul, the culture that has been living in Canada for 300 years is the grout between the bricks of the multiculturalism. If they destroy that, how are they going to hold the country together? And I'm telling you, there is no plan. The plan is chaos. I mean, the mentality we're dealing with at this stage of history is almost a one-to-one match for Christopher Nolan's interpretation of the Joker character in the Dark Knight movie where Heath Ledger played the Joker. That's what we're dealing with. There is no plan. Like he says to Harvey Dent in the bed, he says, I don't have a plan. I'm like a dog chasing a car. I wouldn't know what to do if I caught it. That's what we're dealing with. Now, as all of this multiculturalism has been going on, there's only one culture in the world that's been going in the opposite direction. And that is the Jewish culture. They're being repatriated into a homeland, and it's unicultural. They're all Jewish. They all think the same. They all have the same cultural background. They all study the same occult books. And they all have the same goals according to their rabbi's interpretation of prophecy. And I've already stated, prophecy is the most bullshit spiritual instruction on the planet because it infantilizes you. The great prophet told you what's going to happen in the future. Don't you question it. Don't think you have a connection with God. The great prophet is there to tell you. It's nonsense. It's black magic. It's voodoo. So Israel is coming into one region, which is why they want to expand now. So part of the reason for the chaos in the Western cultures is they're shaking the tree to get the remaining Jews out to make aliyah to Israel. You heard it here first. You wait and see what happens over the next few years. You will see a massive exodus of American Jews. Once they've squeezed the sponge dry and they can't get another drop out of it, they're all going to go to Israel. But before that happens, all of these well-placed Jews in European and North American culture and Australian culture have to stay in place as agents to ensure the pressure stays on the domestic governments of our countries to support the expansion of Israel, and then they're exporting the affected people to our countries to cut our throats. You see how it works? Now remember what I told you. When they say God, they mean them. That is a satanic postulate, by the way. Colonel Michael Aquino, the head of the Satanic Church and the guy who introduced the Satanic Church into the U.S. military, said the same thing. He said it right on the Oprah Winfrey Show. We're all gods. Black magician and a pedophile. So the blood culture is going back to the land of blood to build their temple and commence formal blood culture again. Now I've already told you what my thesis is. That the construction of the temple is a magical amplifier. So the death portal that's created in a sacrifice, because anytime you kill something, a portal is opened. Huge portals are opened up in a war. Huge. Okay? Doesn't mean things come into our physicality. When I say portal, generally it's on the astral plane. The trauma. And the nuclear weapons do the same thing as well. They poke little holes in the fabric of our reality, portals, if you will. And things non-physical can come in through those portals. And then they're in the fourth dimensional space around the earth. And then they can start affecting human beings' thoughts. You see a lot of people going crazy now? Is it crazy? Or do they have more than one voice in their head? Go all the way back to the devil chapter. This is why I explain the devil at the beginning of the middle section. Well, first is the last free breath, to give you the scope of the plan and when it began, and to give you a context for my overall thesis. I should also point out that it's not just a Jewish thing at this point. That it's an amalgamation of these occult societies. I suppose if they were to win and they got their way, they'd end up fighting each other, because it's in their nature to fight, because like the motto of the Immortals in the movie Highlander, there can only be one. And when you think like that in a non-sharing and a non-giving way, you're always going to be fighting to see who sits on the throne. It's quite a pickle we're in. Quite a pickle indeed. How many of you know your Bible? How many of you know what Cain offered God and what Abel offered God? You know that God favored Abel's offering. But do you remember what the offerings were? Not many people actually look at the text. and think about it with an open mind. According to the King James Version of the Bible, Cain offered fruit to God from the orchards he had planted. Abel slaughtered a relatively newborn lamb and gave the best parts of meat and the fatty parts to God. God favored Abel's offering. Now, for those of you who have studied more than one religion, or for those of you who might be Buddhist, or some form of Eastern path that favors self-development through spiritual practice over book, you would be part of a culture that generally advocates vegetarianism for the most part. They're not strict about it, though. In Buddhism, you're not allowed to have an animal deliberately killed for you. But because it's a mendicant path, meaning that they beg, if you're offered meat, you can eat it. But generally, serious Buddhists won't eat that much meat. In terms of spiritual symbology, the most spiritual of foods is fruit. One might say that fruit was developed specifically for the human race. It's up in a tree, it hangs off a branch. Some of the bigger fruit is more difficult for the smaller mammals like squirrels to get at. The skin is fairly thick in many instances, so the insects can't easily get inside of it, like an orange, a tangerine, a lemon, a lime. It seems as though this food was made for human beings. The mammals don't care for it that much. I mean, if I eat an apple up here and I throw it into the row of hedges in front of my house, and I go check it out 20 minutes later, the ants will be all over it because they like the sugar. But they won't go up a tree and eat an eat an apple. After I'm done with it and I throw it on the ground, they'll eat it. Why is fruit a highly spiritual food? Well, it's light, easy to digest, nothing dies, the tree is in service to humanity, you eat the fruit, it's full of vitamins, it has a high level of natural sugars which are very good for us. You can live on fruit. The word is a fruitopian, somebody who lives on fruit. And in my study of religions globally, fruit has always been a symbol of high spiritual value in terms of food. Where do we see fruit? In the book of Genesis. The serpent offers the apple to Eve, the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. But let's not go there. Let's stay with the point I'm making. God is more pleased by the animal Abel slaughtered than he is by Cain's fruit. For those of you, again, who have a cursory understanding of the global phenomenon of spirituality and religion, not just ours in the West, which is the Abrahamic system, from Adam to Moses, ask yourself this: what God would prefer a slain animal over fruit as a spiritual offering? Do you think if you went 2,500 years ago to the Buddha and said, hey, I just killed a lamb for you, I brought you the best parts of the meat, and another student went and had a basket of fruit that he'd picked, and he said, my family planted this orchard 20 years ago, it's fully mature now, we'd like to offer you our fruit. Which do you think the Buddha would regard as the higher offering? The opposite of the Jewish God. The opposite. Then as we come up into the teachings of the Abrahamic system, we get a human blood sacrifice in the form of Jesus Christ. A blood offering to atone for the sins of the world. And this idea that the sins can be atoned by sacrificing an animal has got to be the craziest shit I've ever heard in my life. You cannot atone for sins. Okay? You can do good. You can try to balance the scale. Okay? Do what your heart tells you. Great example of that is a Clint Eastwood movie called Gran Torino. A tortured Korean War veteran in his last days, haunted by what he did in the war, and he saves a young Asian boy from a gang of his own ethnicity. Brilliant story about the recalibration of the heart, okay? But if you think killing an animal can atone for your crazy. And if you think the death of a single person can atone for your sins, the death of Jesus Christ, if he even died, and I doubt he did, seriously doubt he did, okay? So the whole Jesus story is off as we're given it in Scripture. It's completely off. No offense to Christians, okay? The actual words spoken or attributed to the Christ are of value. I've said this time and time again. They line up with universal spiritual culture. We all come from a creator. That creator is all things in the organic spectrum, in the life spectrum, in the universal spectrum. We're all at a certain level connected. We're an energetic expression of individuality while we're incarnate. We're all one thing. In our final form, we're one thing. The process of individuation it allows you, in my theology and my cosmology, to simultaneously go in and out of merging with the whole and back into your individuality. So you get the best of both. This is what you become at the end of the cycle, in my opinion, in my cosmology. The principle of atonement, if it has any value at all, is the opening of the heart to love again. Okay? But it does not negate your karma. You can atone for your sins. And then when you feel the pain, what happens? You become them. I'm sure some of you have watched some of these near-death experiences on YouTube. They're prolific now. The culture of the near-death experience has become a thing now in the West. And everybody discusses the afterlife review. One of the aspects of the afterlife review is as you go through the key events of your life, you how in the fuck is killing an animal going to negate that? Can anybody explain? Any rabbis want to explain that to me? It's absolute nonsense. Complete nonsense. So the first thing to understand, blood. Okay? It revolves around blood, period. Why? And why are all these perverse, occult, fetishistic practices involving blood so prolific now? That's enough for today. Part one is just to introduce the idea that if you're in the West, if you're part of the cultural matrix of the West, review.